So I just wanted to say that I've been coming to the Goose for a long time, and not once have I done a session on my own until yesterday, where Colton, my dialogue partner, said, I need a break. So I'm really glad that Colton got good rest last night and can join me this morning to talk about fugitivity. Now, you might be wondering what this term is, fugitivity, and what the hell does it have to do with a place like Wild Goose? Or what could it mean for you? Colton and I are going to frame fugitivity at the end of Empire for you and invite you into a kind of political orientation of fugitivity at the end of Empire as we survive Babylon, the last days of Babylon. We want to invite you into this conversation. So we're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to hopefully have some time for questions and comments, because if you know me, you know that I prefer conversation over being a talking head. So, and it's relationships all the way down for me. So how can we generate relationships from this conversation, from this session together? So I just want to invite Colton, who is my dialogue partner. I've been praying for a conversation partner. God brought me Colton through my teacher, Dr. Nancy Bedford, for which I am extremely grateful. And I just want to invite Colton to help us understand this term, being fugitive or fugitivity. Colton, can you give us a point of departure for this term, fugitivity?
Yeah, absolutely. And before jumping in, I'll just say a little bit more about myself so you guys have some context of where I'm coming from. Thank you so much for the hospitality at Wild Goose. This is my first time here. And so I have been celebrating, I think, the radical imagination and the vision of Christianity that is present among so many folks here. My name is Colton Bernasol. I am from the Midwest, a small suburb just at the end of the Chicago sprawls called Plainfield. I'm Filipino and Mexican American, inhabiting La Frontera, the borderland, which is a significant metaphor for both Roberto and I. My family is comes from tenant farming. Tenant farmers in the Philippines who farmed land they didn't own, and tenant farmers who were also seasonal migrant farmers who worked across the United States, working on land that they didn't own. I am still living in Chicago, where I'm a writer and an editor for the Institute for Christian Socialism. So I am someone who is thinking quite a bit about the radical politics that is latent and present in Christianity that remains hidden because of the ways that Christianity has been co-opted by folks who are using it as a religion of power, who are using it to create a hostile religion, a religion hostile to difference, to people of color, to queer bodies, to incarcerated bodies. And so this is where I am coming from. So the term fugitivity actually comes from Black studies scholars, and it is of use in the academy, but has yet to really kind of break into politics outside of the academy. And fugitivity is a word that scholars are using to think about ideas of freedom that were articulated in conditions of violence and oppression. So you have colonists who are asking about freedom, liberal philosophers, liberal theologians who are thinking about freedom in terms of the right to property, the right to prosperity, and then you have alternative forms of freedom.
Hang on 1 second. So liberal, we don't mean liberal versus conservative. We mean a type of philosophy that is rooted in 19th century liberalism that accelerates this hyper-individualism that shows up in white society.
Thank you. Yeah, Roberto is my helpful translation partner, reminding me that I need to switch
footnotes.
Switch codes.
I'm the footnoter.
Footnotes. But Roberto needs to be more in the main text as well. And so you have these thinkers who are turning to fugitive slaves, who are turning to free blacks in the 19th century, and abolitionists who are imagining a different kind of freedom, a freedom that's not dependent on private property, a freedom that is communally oriented, a freedom that wants to think outside of the logic of possession. And so I'll stop there and see if Roberto wants to add anything.
Yeah, so thank you for that. That's great. I want to turn to the New Testament because we can see an example of fugitivity in the New Testament. And I want to invite you into a hermeneutic of suspicion and a hermeneutic of curiosity, a hermeneutic of imagination with the politics of refusal, refusing the bullshit that the empire tells us to believe in, and an openness to what the Ruach or what the Spirit might be leading us toward. Jesus outfoxed the empire. That is fugitivity. How can we, now I am Mexican American, my family's from Oaxaca, Mexico, but I didn't get the melanin that my mom has. So I moved through the world with power, access, and privilege, which many of you do too. So how can we outfox the empire? How can we move in such a way that we refuse, have this political orientation of refusal to acquiesce to the empire? What does that look like in your own life? What does that look like in your job, in your relationships? Maybe you're a pastor. How can you help your congregants, your parishioners, your lay people become fugitives in a system that continually forces us to capitulate to the bullshit? So Jesus was a fugitive. And we often don't hear people talk about Jesus that way. We talk about Jesus being the Messiah. We talk about Jesus being the hero. But we actually don't dig into the political context of empire. So Paul was a Roman citizen. He had power, access, and privilege. We are much like Paul. Paul wasn't necessarily a fugitive, but Jesus was. So I want us to think about how can we become like Jesus at the end of empire and embrace fugitivity. My next book is on belonging and freedom. And I'm thinking through becoming fugitive as a way to rethink belonging and freedom. One of the things that I'm thinking about, and one of the reasons why I'm so grateful that Colton is here, is I am thinking through networks of trust, because those have been eradicated. Networks of belonging, those have also gone by the wayside. And networks of solidarity. We could talk a little bit about those three elements. I want to talk about network of solidarity for a minute. Charity is different from solidarity. Charity is like just giving the dollar to the person on the street who's holding the sign, which I think is important work. We need to practice charity. But we need to figure out a relationality of solidarity. One of the ways that I have experienced that is being a beneficiary and being a recipient of people who are in solidarity of me as I seek sanctuary out of Tennessee through means of mutual aid. If we don't take seriously the ways in which capitalism and social capital harms the least of these and the underside of history, we won't be able to embrace fugitivity as a lens through which we experience freedom, because we have not experienced unfreedom. And I experience unfreedom on the daily when I refuse to leave my home because of the death threats, when I refuse to go to the grocery store because I don't know if someone has a gun, because now everyone can have a gun. When I was in South Korea, I tell people it was the safest I've ever felt. I gave a lecture in Seoul to a group of about 100 activists who are fighting the same fight we are over here. I felt the safest. Why? No one can have a gun unless you're in the military or in the police. So I felt safe to go to the grocery store. I felt safe to go find food. I felt safe to walk with my wife on the sidewalk to get coffee or a beverage. Not the same here in the United States. I'm cloistered, tethered to my home because of the harassment, because of the death threats, because how do you seek freedom when you're experiencing this existential crisis of unfreedom? And some of you may have experienced some of this in a variety of ways. I don't know your experience, but some of us may have experienced the lack of freedom in some capacity, and then others maybe not, which is like, that's what makes us human, right? Because we all have different experiences. So I want to start with Network of Solidarity, and I'm wondering, Colton, if you can talk a little bit about some of the teaching and some of the community building you have been doing with this imagination for another possible world. By the way, this phrase, another possible world, I borrow from the Zapatistas, who said no to neoliberal capitalism and NAFTA way back decades ago, and said yes to community. So the Zapatistas, they barter and they trade. They don't use American currency or any currency. Their currency is bartering and trading. No exchange of money. And we need to imagine what could the exchange of labor and resources, how do we do that? And I think it's through networks of solidarity. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, essential to this notion of fugitivity is the dynamic of escape. Fugitives are trying to escape from conditions that deal death. When I think about Roberto's story and the anti-queer and anti-trans legislation that's being passed across the South, turning Roberto's body into a fugitive body, there is this dynamic that freedom and escape are intimately tied together. The kind of individual notions of freedom that I think many of us inherited, certainly ones that I have inherited, I tend to think of freedom as an insular thing. Freedom to possess, freedom to own property, freedom to buy a house, freedom to have what I want. But fugitive freedom depends on networks, communities that are helping and aiding and assisting and standing in solidarity to create escape routes. Right, so you think of, and here I'll go into the history a little bit about it. The 19th century, we tend to look at folks like Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass, right? These famous abolitionists who escaped slavery, and we view them as individuals. But the Underground Railroad was a network of partners, of community members, of societies, anti-slave societies, folks who were hiding in the South, and all of those people, there wasn't a center to it, but they were assisting and helping and subverting the institution of chattel slavery, and that created the kind of escape route into another kind of freedom.
Into another kind of reality.
Into another kind of reality, yeah. Someone who is really important to me that I've been learning a lot from recently is a clerk. You don't think of 19th century clerks as very significant players in ending slavery and fighting for abolition, but there's a man, his name is William Still, and he was a clerk on the Pittsburgh part of the Underground Railroad. He had a desk job, but almost every fugitive slave who stopped through Pennsylvania was connected through William Still. William Still helped connect these fugitive slaves to other resources, helped raise money, and that money was funding the networks and the Underground Railroad to continue this subversive operation. And so when I think about fugitive freedom, fugitivity as a condition, I'm thinking in terms of the kind of hidden underground networks, kind of like the underside of a mushroom that's underground. You see the top node and it looks individual. You see another node here and it looks like it's separate. But when you unbury it, you see this sophisticated network, and they're all part of the same ecology sustaining one another. Fugitive freedom is like that. And I think that I'll use, Roberto, your story is important into, I think, imagining a contemporary example of this. Roberto reached out when and made this public when the legislation was passed, this anti-queer legislation, and Roberto needed to leave the state. He asked for mutual aid. Mutual aid is a bottom-up way of funding the kind of movements needed to help people in times of need. Part of what a contemporary fugitive economy can look like, a fugitive politics of freedom can look like, is to participate in these bottom-up networks of mutual aid, where I'm reaching out to my community in Chicago, folks who might not know Roberto, but who are committed to liberation and who are committed to freedom, not just in Chicago, but also in the South, because our networks are tied to one another. Our freedom in Chicago is bound to the freedom that's possible here in the South. And so I reached out to my community and the organizations that I'm part of, asking if folks would be willing to donate and to give in order to support Roberto's freedom and to aid and to participate in the escape route that Roberto could begin to engage in to find another possible world. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what it's like to participate in that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you brought up networks. I just want to lift up. We had a retreat in April, and some of the folks are here from the retreat, and we were talking about this radical imagination and imagining ethical futures, and what does that look like? And it looks very much like the mycelium underneath the node of the mushroom, creating these networks of belonging and these networks of trust. And when I think about the fact that I have had to search for sanctuary, there are 13 states where I can go, where I won't be criminalized for being trans or queer. None of them are in the South. And that is a grief for me, because I'm committed to the South, I'm committed to being here, and so there's a real sort of Holy Saturday moment that I'm experiencing. I don't know when resurrection will be, but the networks of trust, belonging, and solidarity have afforded me an opportunity to get to safety and to experience freedom. And I think this idea of fugitivity, belonging, and freedom is today's version of discipleship. My next book is on belonging and freedom, and I'm thinking about discipleship. I grew up in a Southern Baptist context where I went to Bible study every Wednesday night, went to Sunday school on Sunday morning, church on Sundays, and then church Sunday night. And that was the mode of discipleship. But now discipleship looks like, who are you in relationship with? And what kind of networks are you building? How are you facilitating a network of belonging with people? How are you facilitating a network of trust with people? And I have had to live by faith, quite literally, because I didn't have the $6,000 to break my apartment lease. Because I don't know if you know, but being a theologian, you don't make a lot of money. It's not one of those six-figure jobs that people might have. And so my wife and I really had to get creative about, okay, if we want to be safe, how do we get to safety? I had to appeal to mutual aid. And that has compelled me to figure out, how do we build these networks to help other people and really move social capital around to help the underside of history. And I don't have all the answers to that, but some of you in this audience gave mutual aid, and I'm grateful for that, because you have afforded me another day with, I feel like, I was telling someone last night, I feel like I've got a target on my back every time I leave, the house. Bad shit could happen, and I'm trying to avoid that. But being a recipient of mutual aid and building relationships with people, not just about money or for economic means, but real relationship to practice the ways of Jesus. Like loving your neighbor seems very basic, but it's actually hard when you practice it. That's what I have felt. I have felt like strangers have loved me into safety. How do we create that part of the church? Where is that congregation? Who's the pastor for that movement? Maybe some of you in this group feel called to steward those networks. And I would say yes to that call, because more of the same is coming. And they're coming for all of us. And if you feel like you're safe, you may have a few years of safety, but if you are a friend of mine, then you're essentially at risk. If you are really in solidarity with trans and queer people, black people, indigenous people, they're coming for you. Jews, Muslims, they're coming for you. And I'm not trying to scare people, but I do want to be very frank and say, how do we resist the bullshit and create another possible world that is composed of freedom? How do we bring heaven to earth? What is our daily bread? How do we practice the ways of Jesus at the end of empire? I think it's becoming fugitive at the end of empire.
Yeah, I think to think biblically about this as well, we have obviously Jesus, who Roberto is reminding us is fugitive, and experienced fugitivity as a child who had to flee into Egypt. But I think Jesus and the New Testament writers who are articulating and trying to make sense of who their teacher was after his death and resurrection, they are recalling a tradition of fugitivity that I think is at the heart of the Hebrew Bible. Roberto and I are deeply, deeply influenced by the traditions of liberation theology that developed among Latin Americans during the 1960s and 70s, and black theologians who developed in who articulated this notion of liberation theology, but really that was a synthesis of a way of doing theology that has existed in North America, in the kind of underside of history among enslaved African Americans. And the book of Exodus is an essential book for articulations of liberation theology and articulations of what liberation might mean. And in that book, I think one can describe God of Sinai, the mountain God of the desolate wilderness who exists outside the bounds of Pharaoh, as a God who brings Israel into a certain kind of fugitivity. It is a condition in which the Israelites escaping a form of oppression have to depend and trust on God and trust in one another in the wilderness. But this is a God who is willing and moves people toward freedom even in desolate conditions, even in the conditions of the wilderness, even in conditions of death. And that is a terrifying thing, I think, to those who are in power. To know that the God who claims, I will be who I will be, right? I will not be bound by the limits of the current political order that we're in, but will transgress them and transform them and prioritize the life of the little ones, is a God who is creating and inviting us into a fugitivity, an interdependent freedom that makes possible not only freedom for me, but freedom for Roberto and freedom for all of us. So I think the significance and the question of what can the church do is and what are the resources for the church in terms of imagining and thinking of itself theologically around notions of fugitivity is to return back to Exodus, return to the story of Jesus, and really ask itself, is the church willing to be faithful to its primal vocation, which is always to nudge against the limits of our current political order, these dehumanizing limits.
Yeah, and I want to say that there's been a tradition where we don't talk politics in the pulpit. But some of y'all need to start talking politics in the pulpit, because these politics are killing people. And God is a God of life. God always has life in front of God. Nick Cave, I don't know if y'all are fans of Nick Cave, but Nick Cave has a song, and the first lines are, "I don't believe in an interventionist God." If we don't believe in an interventionist God, then we've got to get rid of the Exodus story. We've got to get rid of the incarnation. And we've got to get rid of everything that we've really hung our hat on. We've got to believe that God is with us. We've got to believe that God is always pushing the limits against the bullshit and against the current political order. That is what liberation is about. I believe in a God of liberation. I believe in a God that rescues us in our deepest time of need. God has shown me that over and over again, not just when I was 16, when I had an almost fatal brain aneurysm, but just in June when I was able to receive mutual aid, etc. Right? So God always has God in front of God. God always has life in front of God. How do we put life in front of us? Right? It's about reproductive justice. It's about trans rights. It's about queer rights. It's about fighting poverty and not the poor. It is about elections. It's about school boards. Right? Get involved in your local school board, because that's where the banning of the book starts, and then it trickles up. I was just talking to someone yesterday, Reverend Alba Onofrio, who said in Yancey County, 11,000 people live in Yancey County, and they had 4 books for Pride Month displayed celebrating Pride, and one person complained, and they threatened to turn the Yancey County Library into a private entity so that it wouldn't be in the North Carolina public library system. So this is what we're up against. Join your school board, get people registered to vote. I don't believe in electoral politics, but it's like the system that we have. I don't believe in capitalism, but I still got to pay rent. You know, it's like we have to play the game. This is a chess game. What is your strategy? So we have about 20 minutes left, and I really like questions and conversation and really extending the dialogue beyond the intellectualism that we have participated in. So I'm just wondering, does anybody have any curiosities or any questions that we could entertain? Yeah.
Test. What's your strategy around your social media, getting your message out about this fugitive theology?
Well, right now I'm not putting my location on anything because I've received too many death threats and harassment from Proud Boys and neo-Nazis. So I'm not putting my location on things, but I am still trying to get my message out. And, social media is, it's a necessary evil. And it's like I reach so many people through Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and so many people reach out to me, and I do so much pastoral care, right? Which is like unpaid labor. But people are in desperate need right now, trans people in particular. So I am still trying to show up and be present without compromising my safety. And that's a delicate dance that I haven't quite figured out. I generally don't give out my phone number on these social media threads because I don't know who's watching, because we know that everything is under surveillance. So if someone gives me their number, I take that and I communicate through Signal, which is a private encrypted messaging system, to try to safeguard both of us. After the Covenant school shooting in Nashville, I don't know if you heard about that, we gave out a bunch of money to trans and queer people who were staying at home, isolated. Jewish people didn't have money for Passover, and we were I felt compelled, just to give money out. we're getting ready for the retreat. Now we didn't have money to pay for the retreat because we had a crisis. People needed food, you know? And so that's the kind of dance that I'm doing, right? Like trying to get material need to people while also being safe, which is, you know, it's like you're dancing with the devil, you know? Thank you. Yeah, Ellen.
Well, first of all, I want to encourage people to get on your Substack, Our Collective Becoming, because speaking of mutual aid, that's a really good way for a lot of people to give a little bit of money and support you.
And we have a coaster somewhere. I'll put them right here. We brought a few, and you can scan the QR code and get on my Substack. Colton and I are going to be writing together on some stuff on Substack.
Cool. And then, Colton, I just want to thank you. You were talking about Exodus and the God of liberation and et cetera. And I just, I was asking myself the question that I always ask myself in that story. It's like, what the hell do I do with, like, God hardens Pharaoh's heart, which is always just that's a hard one for me. But I had this sudden insight, and so I just want to share it because it really works for me.
Yeah, do it.
It's like, it's not the same God, right? Like, it's not the same God that hardens Pharaoh's heart. The God of liberation, the God of love, did not harden Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh was worshiping a different sort of God. Pharaoh was worshiping a God of imperialism, a God of not capitalism because it's ancient Egypt, right?
Right.
But
their version of economic supremacy.
Right? And then the plagues, it's like power does not care who it hurts. Right? And so it's like power, when power is disrupted and power is challenged, is going to do whatever it can do to keep power in control. And so the plagues, yeah, right? Those gods, those powers that be of oppression, were going to double down.
Right.
And it fucked everybody.
Right.
So,
which is what's happening now.
Yes.
And let me just say, we're winning. Like, why are people doubling down on all these things? It's because we're winning. It's because liberation is in the front.
They're
liberation
scared.
Is winning. Yeah, they are scared.
And can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Like, I wouldn't say that it was a different God. I would say that our understanding of God is ever changing. So, like, it could be that it was a different God, that they were worshiping a different God, or that Pharaoh's understanding of God was like so small, and God is so much bigger than that. Right, yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I love your comments on the interventionist God. Our God is an interventionist. Yet, I always reject God as a puppeteer up there messing with us, you know, and just doing that
We're
thing.
not on puppet strings.
Yeah, so help me discern the difference between that interventionist God and the puppeteer God that maybe is micromanaging our life for good or bad. That type of theology I'm not comfortable with that.
Yeah, I hear you. I am too. And maybe Colton has something to say about this as well. I first want to recommend a book to you by Karl Barth. It's called Evangelical Theology, and it's very readable. And he talks about God of the Gospels. And I also want to recommend his book on prayer to you. Karl Barth said, clasping our hand, essentially he said, I don't have the quote exactly, but clasping our hands together is fighting against the chaos that kills us. That's prayer. In terms of an interventionist God and the puppeteer, we have to remember that these models of religious category developed during the Enlightenment period, and the over-personalization in religion has created God up in the sky puppeteering. And then you have Calvinism and whatnot. And what I prefer to consider is, who is the God of the Gospels? It seems like God shows up in different places, certainly in the form of Jesus, to become like us. So that must mean we are composed of God. So What if the space in between us is mediated by God? What if God is closer than the presence of our own breath? That's how God intervenes. I just commented to Colton about the dew on the grass. I was noticing the dew on the grass, that God is even present in the dew on the grass. And how often do we think about the dew on the grass? My teacher, which is Colton's teacher, she said to me when I finished seminary and sent me off to do the PhD, kicked me out of the nest. She said, your job is to be faithful in the small things. That's what God does. So we are called to be like God. God created humanity so that humanity might become like God. We don't teach that in the church. That's theosis, the doctrine of theosis. We are created for community and created to become like God. Yes, we are sinful. Yes, we fall. Yes, we get angry, but so does God. We have all the emotions that God has, and we are called to be like God, which is why we try every day or endeavor to follow the way of Jesus. You have something to say?
Yeah, definitely. I think just to add, so I'll use this term and then I'll explain it. I believe in the non-competitive relationship between human freedom and divine freedom, which is to say that humans...
This is Catherine Tanner, by the way.
And this is, yeah. So this is from the wonderful theologian Kathy Tanner. She's over at Yale, and she does some wonderful work on theology and economy. But she talks about how God is in a non-competitive relationship with creation, and that the agency of God is always to support the agency of creatures and of creation. And I think that the traditions of fugitivity that we've talked about here are expressions of this. Right. Enslaved folk, marginalized folk, they were receiving a gospel that said that their passivity, their docility was a divine commandment. And yet they felt in their bodies an impulse toward freedom that pushed them to challenge that reductive conception of the gospel, which is not the gospel. It's not good news. It's false news. It's the news of an idol. And they trusted that inner impulse, even when the traditions and the symbols that are supposed to bear witness to God's liberation are being manipulated and contorted. And so they felt within themselves a freedom and a sense of agency to push back. So when I say that God is in a non-competitive relationship with human agency, that is actually an invitation for us to trust our impulse toward freedom. Like Roberto was saying, the doctrine of theosis, that God becomes like humans so that we might become like God, that God empowers us so that we might have an agency to be free in the kinds of ways that God wants us to be free. Yeah. That's an invitation to trust our bodies, to trust our movement.
This is why reproductive justice matters. Yes. Let me just make it very real. God has given us the wherewithal to have agency over our bodies. And also, let's talk about the body of the earth, and let's talk about climate change. We have interpreted Genesis as being that we are to have dominion over land and people, which is part of why I think chattel slavery lasted so long and why it continues in the prison industrial complex. We need to have a different hermeneutic when we're interpreting the Bible. A hermeneutic of suspicion, a hermeneutic of curiosity, and a hermeneutic of imagination. Because we have done damage to ourselves, to each other, and to the land. So we got time for maybe 2 more questions. Anybody else?
Hi, I just want to say first, thank you, Dr. Espinoza, for the language about the current political climate, particularly for queer folks, being Holy Saturday. I am a queer person who lives in Georgia, and I have not had the language to articulate why it's so heavy, and just the recognition that we don't know when resurrection is coming. So I want to say thank you for giving me the words to describe that. And I also wanted to ask, you shared some of your protective strategies for survival in doing this work, and I know that is exhausting. And I was curious if you wouldn't mind to share, both of you, what are some of the strategies that you're using for self-nourishment, particularly as, marginalized people in the world? Like, how are you caring for yourself, not just so you can keep doing the work, but so you can live and just be?
Well, food is a big part of how I stay safe. As a Mexican American, I eat a lot of rice and beans, and that is comfort food for me. So if I have a pot of beans and some rice, I just eat on that, all week. And because I've not been leaving the house out of safety reasons, people have been coming over. And my cocktail wife, as I call her, this is the partner of my film guy, Ben, Rachel comes over and we make cocktails. Because I'm not going out to the speakeasy, right? And so she'll bring some ingredients, I'll have some ingredients, and we'll make cocktails. And then we'll just spend intentional time together. So intentionality, food, drink. And then my wife just had an emergency appendectomy in Atlanta, actually. We were there for our anniversary and also participating in a conference for the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries with Bishop Yvette Flunder. And all these people were praying. Like, people from around the world were praying. And I feel that, And so, and I know that we probably, as progressive people that we are, we don't have the religiosity of other people. But when someone communicates to me and tells me that they are praying for me or that they're thinking about me, it buoys me. Because I'm like, okay, that's someone who cares. So people from all over the world were praying for me and Erin because it was emergency surgery. She was in the hospital for several days. And then I did a meal train, and people just started sending money for us to buy food. Because I was leaving for Wild Goose. She was like, go to Wild Goose. I need time, on my own to relax. And, people sent money for food, and people brought food over. So food, time, prayer. I'm kind of old-fashioned, Like, I believe in Bible study. I believe in prayer. I believe in those little things, What about you?
Yeah. Whoever said community, I mean, that I feel like is what's getting me through these days. It's alongside the anti-queer legislation that's been passed. We obviously have the Supreme Court decisions that have shut down affirmative action and the like. So there's a retrenchment really across the United States that's kind of pulling back some of the like political victories that were gained through the 60s and some of the organizing that was happening then. And so these are, I think, troubling and despairing times. And I think, if I could be honest, I am very, very tired. A lot of writing, a lot of thinking, a lot of dialogue that I'm engaged in where I'm trying to make sense of what's going on. And so many of my friends are, and folks who I love and who have supported me are deeply, deeply wounded and are being wounded. And I think that it is community that has kept me hopeful when I haven't been able to hope for myself. I think that there is a grace in being able to simultaneously be honest about where one is, and also being able to rely on those folks whose love can carry you when you can't carry yourself. I mean, it's that silly depiction of, if you've seen The Lord of the Rings, of Sam carrying Frodo right at the end of his journey. And I feel like that's where I'm at now. I mean, Roberto has been a dear friend of mine, and I've felt the rest of our companionship. And so I think for me, it's alongside the food, community has been really important in terms of my own spiritual nourishment.
So we just have a few minutes left before Mary kicks us off the stage. And I just want to say there's some coasters there where you could sign up for my Substack and by QR code, and also my website to read more about me. Colton and I are doing a trial run of reading Bonhoeffer starting in September through the general election cycle of 2024. We want to create these alternative communities because I'm committed to doing education outside the academy. So if you'd like to join the Bonhoeffer group, please do. We're going to have people come in and speak to us about Bonhoeffer, and we're going to read 4 of his books over the period of about 18 months. So we're just going to meet once a month. You don't have to read the whole book for each time we meet. But you can get more information on my Substack about that. And if the coasters are all gone, if you go to ourcollectivebecoming.com, that's where you can get my Substack. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to be here.